for calling us to order. Hello? Yes, better? Yeah, better. Okay. Happy welcome to all of you. It's the first time we've been able to be in the drape room in some time, and kind of congratulatory about that. I want to tell you a little bit about what we have planned upcoming. Next week on the 4th, Wednesday evening, Craig McCart will be doing a presentation called Images of Early Eastman. He has collected some great images of how Eastman came to be, which will cover a history of what led up to the founding and then the completion of the first 25 years. Craig has lived in Eastman with his wife for 17 years. He's a member of the Woodlands and Wildlife Committee and the Eastman Living Editorial Board. He has served on Grantham's Historical Society Board, Open Space Committee, and the Conservation Commission. His career was as a product designer and professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and Rochester Institute of Technology. So he's going to be really looking forward to that and see what he can do. The following week on the 18th, Kelly Breyer was the executive director of the New Hampshire Granite State Ambassadors. I don't know if you've known about these people, but they're volunteers who go around and give talks about some of the sites and features of living in New Hampshire and visiting in New Hampshire. And they sometimes are at the airport, and that evening they would find about their program, which offers a certification, and maybe some of you might be interested in joining in that project. Okay. So now my pleasure to introduce this program called The Common Loon. And I just told Caroline, before I came here, because we are calling this the Common Loon New Hampshire icon, I Googled, in what states are there the most loons? Well, New Hampshire's not one of them. Minnesota, Maine, and Wisconsin. But we have the best ones, of course. And all of you are probably exposed to the many comments about loons that we make on highlights or in some of the emails. Everybody's watching our loons, and we will have particular questions, I'm sure, about the specific adventures that you have had with the loons here at Eastman. Caroline, maybe you can introduce your program as well and your organization.
Absolutely.
Which would be great too. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, good. I've never been very good at knowing where to hold the mic, so if there's ever a point you can't hear me, just if someone could raise their hand, that would be great. Yeah, if we could turn the lights off, that would be great. So, my name is Caroline Hughes. I'm a biologist at the Loon Preservation Committee. I'll talk a little bit more about LPC later on in the talk, but as a brief intro, we are a nonprofit organization. We were founded in 1975 in response to a noticeable and dramatic decline in New Hampshire's loon population. And the founding principle was really that if human actions had contributed to that decline, then human actions could also help to reverse it. And so that's what we've been working to do since then. And I'll get into all of the work that we're doing on that front a little later in the talk. But I'm going to start out with a discussion of loon biology, life history. Then we'll get into the threats to loons when they're on our lakes, and then we'll get into the work being done to protect loons, and then I'll finish up with a couple slides on the loons on Eastman, some recent things that have happened with them, and then I'll be glad to take questions at the end. I'm also glad to take questions throughout, so if there's something I'm talking about that you want to know more about, feel free to raise your hand or even just call out a question. Great, so loons are water birds that spend their spring, summer, and into the fall on our lakes here in New Hampshire and across really the northern tier of states in the United States and into Canada. They come to breed and raise their young. Although they spend time on our lakes like geese and ducks, they are not closely related to those birds at all. I think I just lost power to the mic. Let me try to swap over to this second one. Okay, we're back. So they're not closely related to a lot of the other birds that are on our lakes. They're closest.
You're kidding.
Hello? mics last, and if they don't, I'll just try to talk really loud. So they're closely related to penguins, to albatross, and to other diving birds like shearwaters and petrels. Loons, when they're on our lakes, look like this, right? This is their iconic breeding plumage with that black and white checkered back, the black and white striped collar, that bright red eye that's really distinctive, and that long, sharp, black, we call it a dagger-like bill, and loons actually will use that bill like a dagger. If you've ever seen a loon fight, you know they can get...
No, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and explore what's going on.
Okay.
Be right back.
In the meantime, if I talk like this, can everyone hear me okay, or should we wait?
Yes. You're good. You're good.
Okay, we'll continue on then. So yeah, loons are very territorial birds. If you've ever seen them on your lake, with an intruder challenging them, you know that they can fight each other pretty brutally, and they use that bill as a weapon. We'll get a little bit more into that later on. But for now, I wanted to say that, our loons look like this in the summer and the spring, but they don't look like this year-round, right? And so many of you have probably been around the lake later on into the fall when the loons start to molt into their winter plumage. Typically that starts up around their bill and then proceeds across the rest of their body, moving backward. So this is a loon that is just starting its molt. You see that white coloration coming in around the bill. And then by the time they're on their ocean wintering grounds, loons look totally different. So that if you didn't know that they went through this change, you might not recognize this as a loon if you saw it on the ocean. When they are on the ocean, their diet also tends to change. So you see that this loon has a nice lobster that it's caught for itself. We've also received photos of loons eating crabs, snails, even marine worms, and just recently, for the first time ever, we got a photo documenting a loon eating a stingray on the ocean. So their diet is much more varied on the ocean than it is when they're here. When they're here on our lakes, they're primarily eating fish, but they might also eat aquatic invertebrates, leeches, things of that nature. So I mentioned that loons spend their winters on the ocean, but as soon as the ice goes out on our lakes, they tend to come back. Our loons here in New Hampshire spend the winter primarily off of the New England coast. So we've seen banded New Hampshire loons as far north as Mount Desert Island and as far south as North Carolina. We actually just recovered a loon this past year. But really the majority of band resites and recoveries that we've had of New Hampshire loons have been off of the coast of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. So they stay pretty close. And that allows them to, in the spring, take recon flights to and from the ocean to check and see if their lake is open. If it's not open, they might head back, or they might, land on a river or another water body in the area that is open. And it's really beneficial for loons to get back to their lake as soon as they can in the spring. Because, as I mentioned before, loons are a species that fight for territories. So if that, the member of the pair that has been on that lake in the past, if it waits too long to come back, then it might come back and find that it's been replaced and that it needs to battle for, rights to its territory again. So they tend to show up the day of ice out, the day after ice out. I did hear from someone that the loons have been back on Eastman for a couple of weeks now, so I bet they did show up very soon after the ice went out. And then over the next couple of weeks, the loons spend time getting reacquainted with one another. As far as we're aware, the members of the pair do not spend the winter together. And so, they need some time to get back in the swing of things with each other, to get reacquainted. Courtship in loons is very, very subtle. So unlike some other birds, you'll never see them do a breeding dance, a mating dance, courtship dance. If you ever see loons doing something, flashy and splashy, chances are they're either preening, bathing, or they're in a fight with another loon. And so this photo here shows one of those really subtle courtship behaviors. This is bill dipping. So it's just a very, very subtle decline of the bill towards the other one that is, deferential to their partner. You might also see your loons just drifting together peacefully. They might fish and forage together. You might see one of them sleeping while the other one's nearby. If you see that, you can pretty much guarantee that that's your pair, because a loon wouldn't, be caught sleeping with an intruder on the lake. And then, anytime between mid-May and mid to late June, you'll probably see your loons start to check out nest sites. So they'll, move along the shoreline or along the shoreline of islands. They might climb up, test out a site, build a bowl a little bit, get back in the water. And then, yeah, usually by early June, they have started to nest. Some loons do nest earlier. We've had reports of loon nests as early as the first week of May. And we've also documented loons starting a nest as late as July 20th, which is very, very late. But the majority of our loons will be on the nest by the end of the first week in June. And normally they lay 2 eggs. Sometimes they lay just 1, and on very, very rare occasions they may lay 3. But most often it's 2, and most often those eggs are laid 12 to 24 hours apart, and it's really closer to 24 hours apart. After the second egg is laid, they start to incubate continuously. So sometimes we get calls from people who are concerned because their loons have laid 1 egg, and they're just kind of ignoring it. You know, they laid it a day ago, and they're not on the nest yet. That's pretty typical. Usually they won't start that continuous incubation until their clutch is complete. The male and the female loon do share incubation duties pretty much equally. At the start of the incubation period, the male will actually take on a little bit more of those duties because the female has just laid these 2 giant eggs. It's a very costly, energetic process to produce those eggs and to lay them, and so she needs just a little bit more time off the nest to forage and gain her energy stores back. But by the time they're midway through that incubation period, they're about 50-50. And then towards the end of the incubation period, the female will actually, on average, be incubating a little bit more. So it basically balances out over the course of that 28-day period. And then because those eggs were laid asynchronously, they also hatch asynchronously. So you'll have one chick hatch 12 to 24 hours before its sibling. And that means that that chick is, a little bit stronger. It's been fed by the parents. It's gotten the chance to get out on the water and swim. And so it creates a dominant structure between these chicks where that first chick lets its sibling know who's boss. It will make sure that it's received its fill to eat before it lets its sibling eat. And for us watching that as humans, that can be really heartbreaking, right? We don't want to see that bullying going on. But it's a strategy that loons have evolved to make sure that in a year when there's less food available, at least one chick will survive and make it to the end of the season instead of the loons dividing the resources and neither chick getting enough. I will add that loons can and do re-nest if their first nest attempt fails. So last year on Eastman we had 2 separate nest attempts. Unfortunately both failed, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Last year we did have, in Ossipee, New Hampshire, a loon pair that nested 4 times. And they never succeeded, unfortunately, but they just kept trying. They were on the nest from late May through early September. So that was a really, tough thing. We just wanted to message them somehow that they should give it up. Yeah, so, watching these loons can really be heartbreaking, right? You want them to succeed, and it just doesn't always happen for them. So when the chicks hatch, they're what we call semi-precocial. So precocial in that, unlike other birds, they don't hatch naked. They're covered in down, and they really only need a couple hours on the nest to dry out before they're able to get in the water and swim. They can dive at this point, but they're so buoyant that it's, they kind of pop right back up like a cork. And so semi and semi-precocial, because even though there are so many things that they are able to do right away, the one thing that they're not able to do is provide their own food. They're 100% dependent on their parents at this point. And so a scene like the one you're seeing here is pretty common during the first couple weeks of a loon chick's life. They back ride on the parents for a couple of reasons. First is protection from underwater predators. Things like a snapping turtle or even large fish like pickerel or largemouth bass can and will go after a loon chick. And so being up on the parent's back just gives them a barrier between them and that threat. It also helps them with temperature regulation. That chick is really small, and to them the water can be pretty cold. And so being able to get up on the back, snuggle under the wings, helps them to stay warm. And then the third is that it's, again, a very small chick, so they don't have large energy stores yet, and they can get tired. So being able to get a ride from mom or dad is always helpful. But the chicks don't stay small for long, right? Over the course of the first 12 weeks of their life, they grow to be about the size of an adult. So the photo here shows a chick at 5 to 6 weeks of age. You'll notice that its down is starting to be replaced here by the first set of plumage. We refer to this stage as the punk rock stage often because these chicks just look so scruffy, and you might see them, swimming by with a little down mohawk as they develop that first set of plumage. You'll also notice that the chick's bill has started to elongate and take on a little bit more of that classic loon bill shape as compared with the chick here. And what you can't see in this photo is that in addition to the bill growing a lot in the first couple weeks of the chick's life, a lot of the growth is also concentrated on the legs and the feet, and that's because they need those in order to dive and swim and catch food. So a chick at this age, 5 to 6 weeks old, can catch probably 40% of its own food, but it's still very, very heavily dependent on its parents. And it's not uncommon to see loon chicks doing what the chick in this photo is doing, which is begging its parent for food. They'll nip at the parent's neck or even, grab onto their bill with their own bill and, kind of give the parents a shake. They'll headbutt them. They'll just sort of generally be very annoying to let the parent know that they're hungry and they want to be fed. And then, by the time the chicks are 12 weeks old, they're about the size of an adult loon. They, have totally taken on that classic loon shape. They've developed their first set of plumage, and they are totally self-sufficient. They can catch 100% of their own food, although you will still see them begging the parent for a free meal if they can get it, sort of like the college student coming home and raiding your fridge. Last year, we got a photo from Hughes Lake in Sutton of an 18-week-old chick begging its parent for food, and the parent actually obliging and giving it a fish. So loon parents can be very tolerant. And so at this point, the adults actually leave the lake in the fall. Adults will leave anytime between mid-September through November or early December. And typically, one adult will leave first. The second one will stay with the chick for another week or two, but then that adult leaves as well. And then these chicks are on their own to try to find their way to the ocean, to their wintering grounds for the first time, which is a pretty tall order, right, considering that they've never been there before. So they must hatch with, just innate instincts that allow them to know where to go. Another thing that you'll often see in the fall is big groups of loon chicks, especially on larger lakes. That's called staging. It's sort of a pre-migration behavior where they all, or a lot of them, gather up together and then take off together. And that's probably a safety in numbers kind of thing. It's just more likely that they're going to get where they need to go if they all go together. Once these chicks leave the lake, they will not return to lakes until they're 3 years old. So they'll spend a couple of years on the ocean. 3 years old is when they develop that breeding plumage for the first time. It's when they're reproductively mature and when they're able to, breed it for the first time. What we found is that even though they can breed at 3 years of age, more often they're not doing so until 5, 6, or even 7 years old. That's because it takes some time for them to, find a territory of their own, get settled, find out where the good nest site on that territory is. So usually, they're a little bit older. They have a delayed age of first reproduction. And a lot of those intruder loons that you see, coming onto the lake and maybe challenging a member of the pair are probably those young loons that are trying to find a spot to fit in. A lot of the time, they'll try to take over a territory from an established, pair member rather than, settling on a lake that doesn't currently have loons on it. That's because, that lake that another loon pair is on is sort of a sure thing. They know that other loons have considered it to be a good territory, and so they figure it's probably a good spot to be. Research has also shown that the loons that don't have a territory will kind of keep an eye on other territories and, figure out which ones have succeeded, and then in the next year target those territories for takeover. Again, because it's, it's proven to produce chicks, it seems like a good spot for them to be. Any questions on any of that before we move on to the threat section? Yes?
So, if there's a loon in, let's say, Minnesota, like, there's a lot of lakes in Minnesota, which ocean would they go to?
The Minnesota loons tend to go down to the Gulf of Mexico area, so they're primarily off the Florida, Louisiana coasts. Yeah, and then the loons that breed on the western part of the country, so there are loons in Washington, they'll go to the Pacific Ocean. And Canada kind of divides up that way as well. The loons that are in the eastern parts of Canada come down to the east coast of the Atlantic Ocean. The western loons will go to the Pacific. And then those loons in the middle of the continent tend to come down to the Gulf of Mexico.
Thank you.
Yes?
How old are they before they learn to fly?
So they usually start practicing flight when they're around 8 weeks old. So you'll see the chicks, flapping their wings, running across the water, trying to take off. And in those early days, usually they'll get partially there and then fall back down. So they spend a couple weeks building up those wing muscles, but it's by about 12 weeks that they're able to take off and achieve flight. Yes?
Is it possible to tell the gender of an adult loon?
That's a good question. So, and visually, not really. The plumage is totally the same. Males do tend to be about 25% larger than the females, so if there's a noticeable size difference between your loons, it's probably a safe bet that the bigger one is the male, although not always. You know, there have been loon pairs where it's a particularly small male, a particularly large female, and so the bigger one is actually the female. But most often, the male is bigger. The other thing is that only male loons do the Yodel call, and I don't know if I have an internet connection here. We can test that at the end, and if I'm able to get online, I can play a Yodel call for you guys at the end. So yeah, only the male loons Yodel, so that's, you know, if your loons aren't banded, that's the only surefire way to know if you're watching the male versus the female, is if you hear that Yodel call. Yes?
Do individuals winter in the same spot each year?
So the research on that is a little bit more limited than the research on breeding territories, but what we do know, or what we have learned, seems to suggest that they do. That they have a general area on the ocean that they return to year after year. And between individual, again, it's only a small number of loons that have been tracked to the ocean, but there seems to be a very large, range in the size of the area that they occupy on their wintering grounds. But yeah, so typically they will return to the same ocean spot year after year as well. Yes?
What generally are the proportions of male to female chicks?
That's a really good question, and not something that we've been able to study, because again, unless you run genetic tests on, blood samples collected or whatever, it's not possible to tell the genders apart, because the chicks can't yodel, right? They develop the yodel later on in life. So it's a really good question, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you. Yes?
So like, the size of Eastman Lake, how many, in terms of territorial, how many pairs does it support?
Yeah, I think Eastman is a size where it's probably only going to support a single pair of loons. Generally, a pair, a pond would have to be 400 or 500 acres before it could support a second pair of loons. So Eastman's probably good with just one. Yes?
Do loons always return to the same lake once they pair? Do they come back to that lake again?
Typically they do. And especially if they've been successful on that lake in the past, they want that territory again. But, there's that old, I don't want to say myth, but that old myth that loons mate for life. They actually don't. They're more loyal to their territory than they are to each other. And so, a good territory is harder to find than a good mate. And so, if a loon's mate is challenged by an intruder and loses that fight, that bird is kicked off. And that intruder becomes the new member of the pair, and the mate of the other one will just accept that new mate because it doesn't want to risk losing its territory. It's not gonna, follow its old mate off to prospect for a new one. So in general, there's a good chance that it is your same pair back every year. But if a loon gets kicked off, then it has to find a new spot to go. And we have seen sometimes, a little more rarely, but loons that will seem to willingly make the switch. We have a couple banded loons who their old territory, is no longer occupied. They've moved on, and their old mate is on that old lake just by itself for whatever reason. Yeah, but in general, yes. Yes.
What about their breeding or nesting grounds? What's the typical type? Where do they do?
Yeah, so loons really prefer to nest on the leeward side of small islands, protected area that's not likely to have mammal predators living on the island. If there's not a good island site on the lake, they might also nest in a marshy area. And on lakes that have neither of those, they will sometimes try to nest on the shoreline of a protected cove, but islands are really, the best spot for them to be. Yes?
Will they actually go back to nest at the same location on an island?
Yeah, typically, especially if their nest there has been successful in the past, they'll use that same site over and over, and even sometimes if the first nest attempt in a year fails, sometimes they will use that same site again and just try it out again.
Thank you.
Yes?
If a new loon challenges a loon on the lake, do they always challenge the loon of the same gender?
Yes, that's right. So both male and female loons do fight, and sometimes fight to the death for their territory. So if the intruder is a male, the male of the pair will go out to meet that loon and, you know, fight or try to chase it off. And if it's a female, same thing. We work with a veterinarian at, well, he's an emeritus professor at Tufts Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. He does all the loon necropsies for us, him and his students, and he's now starting to train our staff to do them as well. But he's found holes in the sternums of about 50% of the loons that he necropsies. So they're fighting pretty hard. And those, you know, the loon doesn't necessarily always die from that. A lot of the time, they're able to recover from that injury. But about 6% of the loons that have died in New Hampshire since 1989, that we've been able to document anyway, have died from loon violence. Yes?
When the new loons leave the lake for the first time at the end of the summer, how far can they fly, you know, uninterrupted, so to speak? Do they make stops along the way to the seashore?
So our loons here in New Hampshire probably do it all in one go. They don't have very far to fly, but those loons that are breeding in Wisconsin, Minnesota, that have to go all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, definitely are making stopovers. I'm not sure exactly how far between stopovers they need. That's a really good question. Yes?
Are there any nesting sites that have webcams?
Yes, and so I'm actually going to set up our first webcam of the season this coming Monday. So that's on a lake in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, and I'm hoping that it'll be live by Monday night, but it might end up that we need a couple days to, you know, get the bugs out before we go live. But by the end of next week on the Loon Preservation Committee YouTube channel, there should be a loon cam running. And then on some other nests, we'll put out game cameras, so it's not collecting video footage, but it's collecting photos. A lot of the times we'll put those out at sites where, you know, the nest failed and we're not entirely sure why, and we're trying to figure that out the next year. Any other questions? Yes?
I don't know if this is true, but I heard that because we have an increased population of bald eagles, do they hunt? Like, do they prey on loons?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and Claren and I were talking about how we should probably address this in this talk, so thank you for asking it. Eagles will go after loon chicks. Typically, an adult loon is too big for them. So they will go after the chicks. We have documented a couple of cases in New Hampshire where they've, you know, succeeded in predating the chicks. But I will say, the loons, you know, they know what to do to evade that eagle, and they're pretty good at it. So as that eagle swoops, generally the chick is going to dive, and it's going to go hide along the shoreline, while the adult loon sort of lunges up at the eagle. A couple of years ago in Maine, there was actually a documented case where a loon had killed a bald eagle. It had, you know, stabbed it right in the heart. So that's usually not the outcome. You know, it's pretty rare for a loon to kill an eagle, although it does happen. But I would say, you know, we get a lot of reports of eagles predating loon chicks, and when we go out to check, usually it turns out that what someone saw was, you know, that eagle coming down, the adult loons freaking out because they will start calling like crazy. And then, you know, the loon chick escaped. A lot of the time when we get a report, we go and check and find that the loon chick is still there. So they're very good at evading the eagles, but unfortunately, there are some instances where the eagle is able to predate the chick. But not as many as are reported, luckily. Any other questions? All right, I will move on to our threats to loons. So I like this photo because to me it looks like something out of the loon version of Jaws, but also because it illustrates an adaptation that loons have that makes them really good in the water, but really bad on land. And that is that the loon's legs are about as far back as they can possibly be on its body. Right? If this were a duck or a goose, those legs would be about mid-body, but with loons, they're totally far in the back. And that means that when they're in the water, when they kick their feet, they really, are able to maximize the propulsion that they get. But when they're on land, loons cannot walk upright. If you've ever seen loons trying to get up on land to their nest site, it's awkward. They kind of flop down on their chests and then use their feet to push themselves along. So, if you see a loon after it's just gotten off of the nest, oftentimes their chests are totally muddy because they're just pushing themselves through the dirt. And, having to move that way makes loons really vulnerable when they're on land. If a loon was nesting far inland and a predator came, it would have no chance of escaping that predator. And then moving on land is also really, really energetically expensive for loons. It takes a lot of energy for them to get up on land and shuffle themselves around. And so for those two reasons, loons tend to nest on sites that are really, really close to the water's edge. So at sites like this one. And that makes them vulnerable to fluctuating water levels. And so, on lakes that have not been dammed, typically if there are a couple days of really heavy rain, the loons are able to, kind of reach into the muck around them and build up their nests to keep pace with water level rise. But what we found is that on lakes that have been dammed, where those fluctuations can occur much more quickly, loon nests are really prone to flooding, and they're also prone to stranding. And so stranding is just when the water level drops to an extent where it's too much energy for loons to get back to their nest, back and forth between their nests and the water. And so they have to give up and abandon the nest. So water level fluctuations have been a problem for loon nesting success, both here in New Hampshire and also across the loon's breeding range. Human disturbance is another one. So you'll note the difference in the body position between this loon and this loon. This loon is totally relaxed. When loons are relaxed on the nest, they keep their heads up. They might look around their territory. When loons are stressed out by something or feeling threatened, they will assume this position. And what this loon is trying to do is hide, right? It's trying to really minimize its appearance in hopes that the threat that it's perceiving won't notice it. It's also getting into a position, it's basically a dive position, right? So all this loon has to do is kick its feet, and it's back in the water where it's more mobile and therefore less vulnerable. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but if you ever are on the lake and you see a nesting loon doing this, that's an indication that it needs more space and you should back up. I'm going to keep preaching to the choir for a little bit. So when they're on the nest is not the only time that loons are vulnerable to human disturbance. And these are all signs that a loon needs more space. The two on the top are, they're not loons that are feeling threatened yet, but these are loons that are feeling concerned. So when a loon really extends its neck up to its full extent to survey around, that's a sign that it's feeling stressed or it's feeling like there's something that it's just not sure about. And so sometimes this is done in response to an intruder loon on the territory or another natural thing. But if you notice a loon doing this and you don't see any other loons or anything else that's obviously causing it, then it could be that that loon needs more space. And the same goes for the loon on the upper right. So that loon is squaring off its brow. Sometimes we get reports from people who think that the loon has been bonked on the head and it's swelling. But this is actually just another sign that the loon is feeling concerned and might need more space. The loons on the bottom row are definitely stressed. So this loon here, this is actually a chick on the bottom left. But that chick is hiding, similar to the loon that was craned down low over the nest. This loon is sinking down lower in the water to try to hide and minimize its appearance. And then the loon on the right is doing what we call the penguin dance. That can be a distraction display. It's a sign that that loon is feeling really, really threatened and stressed out. Sometimes if a loon is flushed off of its nest by a boat getting too close, as soon as it gets in the water, it does this. And penguin dancing, again, takes a lot of energy. And for a wild animal, they work really hard for every bit of energy that they get, right? They have to fight for every fish that they catch. And so, wasting energy unnecessarily because a boat got too close is a problem. So if you see any of these behaviors, those loons need more space. Again, preaching to the choir, thank you for letting me do that. And so there are some other threats to nesting loons as well. Shoreline development is a big one. There are some lakes in our state where, due to the more and more things being built in the spaces that loons like to put their nests, they're forced into really marginal sites where they might be more prone to predation or just other things that affect their nesting success. human commensal mammals, so things like raccoons that have always been around, but now are around in higher densities because they have human sources of food like garbage, tend to be opportunistic predators of loon eggs. And so, just having more of them around means that there's a little bit of a higher chance that a loon's nest might get predated. Avian predators, so we talked about bald eagles, crows, ravens, and gulls will also predate loon eggs. And I feel like it's important for me to say that at the Loon Preservation Committee, we are not anti-eagle or anti-crow or anti-dog. I think a lot of people expect us to be, but those natural threats are the ones that we prefer loons to be dealing with as opposed to the human-caused threats. Contaminants, this is a relatively new area of research for us, and if you're interested in learning more about it, we did recently publish a paper with our findings to date on contaminants in loon eggs. So every year we collect the inviable eggs from failed nests, and we make sure that they're inviable and have been abandoned before we collect them because we never want to take an egg that has a chance to hatch. We do that all under state and federal permits. And we're able to test a small sample of those eggs for contaminants like PCBs, PFAS, DDT, chloridane, and other contaminants as well. And what we found is that on some lakes, some of those contaminants are at levels or exceeding levels that have been found to cause reproductive impacts in other bird species. So we don't yet know what levels are important for loons, but it's certainly concerning that we're finding them at such high levels. And again, this is an ongoing investigation for us. We also have a video on our YouTube channel that is totally about our contaminants research to date. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can find it on the Loon Preservation Committee YouTube. Another threat, and really the biggest threat to loons, is lead fishing tackle. So this graph shows the documented loon mortalities since 1989. And 40% of the adult loons that we have been able to document that have died in the state have died from the ingestion of lead fishing tackle. It far outweighs any other known source of mortality. Here I just have some radiographs of loons that have died or that we've rescued from lead poisoning. And unfortunately, even a small piece of split shot is enough to kill a loon. And typically, if a loon ingests lead, it will die within 2 to 4 weeks. We've had very little success trying to rehabilitate loons. We have attempted to work with veterinarians and rehabilitators to remove the tackle and chelate them and try to remove that lead from their system. And unfortunately, it really just does not work in most cases unless you catch the lead poisoning really early. We've only had a single case where the loon has survived and come back the next year. So it's basically a death sentence for a loon to ingest tackle. People often ask, how do they ingest tackle? And there are a couple of ways. Number one is that if an angler is fishing and a particularly large fish breaks their line and makes away with that line and the tackle, and then a loon eats that fish, it's also ingesting the tackle. Second is that loons are visual predators, and so if they see something moving through them in the water, especially if that thing has a metallic-looking glint to it, they're going to strike at it because they think it's a minnow or a small fish, and so they can sometimes just pull the tackle off a line in that way. And they also might grab a fish off an angler's line. They've been known to do that. And so if that person is fishing with lead tackle, then that loon is going to ingest that tackle. Another way, which we think is happening but probably less frequently, is that since loons don't have teeth, they ingest pebbles to hold in a muscular portion of their digestive system called their gizzard, and then those pebbles, as they eat, help them to grind their food up, and so they might also occasionally be mistaking a piece of lead tackle from the lake bottom for a pebble. But our data shows that more often it's coming from that active use. Typically we're finding the line and other associated tackle in the loon, and loon deaths from lead poisoning tend to peak in July and August at the same time that fishing pressure also peaks. And so all of these adult loon deaths from lead tackle are a really big problem, primarily due to the loon's life history strategy. They're what we consider a K-selected species. So I already talked about how they have a delayed age of reproduction. And loons also have pretty low reproductive output, right? In a year, the maximum number of chicks they're going to be producing is 2. But what our long-term data set from New Hampshire shows is that on average, a loon pair in New Hampshire will only fledge one chick every other year. So they're contributing to the population slowly, but they make up for it by the fact that they live for a really long time. The oldest documented loon in New Hampshire will be at least 31 years old this year, but more likely she's 34 or older. And we have several other banded loons in New Hampshire that are in their late 20s. So loons live for a long time. But when we lose an adult loon prematurely due to preventable and human caused cause of death like lead tackle ingestion, then we're losing not only that loon, but also any future offspring that it would have produced. And our research, we have a peer-reviewed paper. If anyone's interested in reading it, I can send it along. But it has shown that the lead deaths that New Hampshire's population has experienced have significantly reduced our population growth rate here in New Hampshire. So lead is a big deal. Okay, but I don't want to end on the threats. And actually, I guess before I proceed, I should ask if there are any questions on that threat section. Yes?
Isn't lead lures banned?
Yeah, and so I'll get into that a little bit more in a couple of slides. Yes, so it's currently illegal to use lead sinkers and lead-headed jigs that weigh 1 ounce or less, which is the most protective law anywhere in the United States. New Hampshire is the strongest law. But unfortunately, that ban went into effect in 2016. And so, a lot of people still have tackle bought before the ban or bought in another state where it's not illegal. And so we're continuing to record loon deaths from lead poisoning, unfortunately. Yes?
Have you any evidence regarding the acclimation of loons to fishing? Now, I would say when I first saw loons 60 years ago in Maine, they wouldn't get anywhere near a fishing boat. But I think they have learned that there's some opportunity associated with fishing boats, and they approach much more closely.
Yeah, and so we even see that now, the loons in certain parts of the state that have less fishing pressure or just, see less boats in general tend to be a lot more timid, and, they might even start freaking out as soon as you launch your boat on the lake because they're uncomfortable with you even being, several hundred feet away from them. Whereas some loons, yes, will absolutely come right up to you. We've had reports from one pond in New Hampshire, a trout fishing pond, of loons harassing the people fishing there, following them, trying to take the fish off their line. And it's unfortunate because we have had a lot of loons get tangled, and tangled because they're actively going after someone's line. And so, we can't tell the loons to stop doing that, and so we've had to try to encourage fishermen to, if there are loons in their vicinity, move to another part of the lake, which I know is frustrating as someone going out fishing. But that's sort of the advice that we're giving folks to protect the loon and also to prevent themselves from losing a lure or losing their tackle. Yeah, I wish they didn't do that. Yes.
Is it true that loons are the only bird known that does not have pneumatic bones?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I can look into it and get back to you on that. But I'm not sure. I know. So as we meet crops and loons, they do have, a series of air sacs that they use for as part of that respiration process. And I know other birds have that, but I don't know the specific answer to your question. Yes?
How much do they eat in a day?
So the number that is out there is about 2 pounds per day, and a lot of that is, small fish. Their preferred prey species is it's a 4 to 8 inch perch. They prefer those warm water species that swim a little more erratically because they're easier to catch. But yeah, about 2 pounds a day is the estimate. Any other questions? Yes?
Are you going to tell us about what happened to our loons?
Yes, I will get to that. I'm going to go through the work of section, and then I'll wrap up with that discussion of the Eastern Loon. Yes. Okay, so I think I covered a lot of this at the start. We were founded in 1975 in response to a decline in New Hampshire's loon population. At that time, there were fewer than 100 pairs of loons remaining in the state. And so yeah, we're working to bring the loon population back through a number of different actions. So the first is management. So this photo shows a nest raft, and these rafts are designed to help with a lot of the problems that I discussed earlier in the threat section. So they mimic a small island, which is the loon's preferred nesting site. And so on an area that's been so developed that there are no good natural sites left, this can provide new nesting habitat for the loons. These rafts also rise and fall with water levels so that a loon nesting on them is never going to have its nest flooded or stranded. We have the avian cover over the top to camouflage them and give them a barrier from predators like gulls or ravens or eagles. And then these rafts are, we put them out from shore so that, it doesn't guarantee that a mammal isn't going to swim out and try to predate those eggs, but it makes it a little bit less likely. And studies have shown that predation rates are significantly lower on nest rafts. We will also, in some cases, put out signs to keep people away from nests. Typically, we do that in areas that are high traffic or where the loon nest is in a spot where it's, hidden enough that people might inadvertently get too close because they don't realize that it's there. This sign is one of the ones that we put out on Lake Winnipesaukee. The ones that we put out on smaller lakes like Eastman are a little bit more polite. They say, please stay away, instead of keep out. But we found that the people on Winnipesaukee tend to need a stronger message. And then at sites where, despite the signs being out, human disturbance has continued to be a problem, we might also put out these rope lines. And so the rope line, creates a physical barrier, shows people, you shouldn't be going any closer to this nest. We do a lot of public education and outreach. So in a given year, we'll give over 100 presentations like the one I'm giving you tonight. We also partner with the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center in Holderness to do loon cruises. So if you're ever in the area, I highly recommend it. Our Squam Lakes biologist, Tiffany, leads those cruises, and she's a fantastic speaker. We also do the live loon cam, so I mentioned that this will be going live soon. And the loon cam is really cool because it allows you to get this really intimate view of the entire nesting process, from the loons selecting the nest site to building up the nest bowl. Sometimes we get very graphic video of the loons laying the eggs. And then we get to watch as they incubate, and as they get visitors from other species, like this heron landing on the raft. Sometimes people will ask me if herons are a predator of loons, and based on the fact that this loon is not reacting at all to the heron on top of the raft, I'd have to say no. And then we get a really intimate view of the hatch, and so I really like this photo because you see the first chick has hatched, and I don't know how well you can see it, but right here on the second egg, that's where that second chick is starting to break out. So even if you were a couple hundred yards away from a loon nest watching through your binoculars, you probably wouldn't get a view as good as this one. So if you're interested in watching the loon's nest close up, I highly recommend watching the loon cam, which again should be live by the end of next week. And then we have done a lot of work to get lead tackle banned in New Hampshire, and now that it has been banned, we're working on getting that old lead tackle out of people's tackle boxes. And so we do operate a lead tackle buyback program in conjunction with Fish and Game and with local tackle shops across the state. So folks can take their now illegal lead fishing tackle to those locations and turn it in, and in return they get a $10 voucher to that store. This year we also have prizes for the biggest turn-ins at each shop. So the person who turns in the largest amount of tackle will receive a $100 cash prize. The second largest gets a $50 cash prize. So we're really serious about trying to remove lead from active use, and in doing so protect loons. If you're interested in participating in that program, or if you know someone who might have lead tackle to get rid of, please encourage them to go to loonsafe.org. That's our website. That's where they can find the list of those participating retail locations. We'll do loon rescues. So I did a loon rescue actually a couple of years ago on Eastman, which we'll get into a little bit later. But yeah, people report loons in distress to us all the time. Unfortunately, loons do tend to get in trouble, whether that's getting tangled in fishing line, whether that's ingesting lead, whether that's getting into a bad fight with another loon where the loon's just up on the shore. And so we will come out rescue the loons, take a blood sample, try to figure out what's wrong. We usually take them to a veterinarian for a radiograph as well. And our goal is to get those loons back out onto the lake as soon as possible. So if you see a loon ailing on Eastman, please do let us know, or on any lake really. Please let us know because we can come out and help that loon. And then I'll sort of fly through these because I'm a little later than I intended to be. But we do a lot of different research into the problems affecting loons. We band and track loons so that we can monitor them over time. We look into the causes of loon mortality so that we can keep an eye on, trends and things causing them to die. It's how we figured out that lead was such a big problem, and we'll continue to necropsy loons to keep an eye on emerging threats. We're looking at the effects of climate change on loon reproduction. Loons are a northern dwelling species, and here in New Hampshire, we're very close to the southern extent of their breeding range, and things like increasing temperatures and changing precipitation patterns can threaten nesting success, so we're looking into that. Effects of contaminants on loon reproduction I addressed earlier. We're also working with Jim Haney's lab at University of New Hampshire to look at cyanotoxins. So every time we band a loon, we take a blood sample and we send some of that blood to Jim so that he can look at cyanotoxin levels and compare it with the data on those toxins that he's getting from plankton samples and fish samples. Effects of lead on loon survival and population growth rates, I think we covered pretty well. And then we're also looking at the causes of nest failure, and similar to the causes of mortality, we're just trying to keep an eye on any emerging threats and trying to figure out if there are new or additional things that we should be doing to try to protect loons from any of those emerging threats. We do monitoring. It's really the bread and butter of what we do in New Hampshire. We divide the state up into these 5 geographic regions that each get a biologist to cover the lakes within them. So here we're in the Sunapee region. And then we have a biologist for Squam, a biologist for Winnipesaukee, and a biologist for Mbagog, because those lakes all have many loon pairs and require a dedicated person. When we're monitoring, what we're trying to do is count loons. So figure out how many loons there are in the state, how many of those loons form a pair, how many of those pairs nest, how many of those nests succeed, how many chicks hatch throughout the state, how many of those chicks survive to the end of the season. And in doing so, we're able to track how the population is doing, and on an individual lake, we're also able to determine whether the management that we're doing is helping or not. So if we put out a raft, we want to know, has breeding success increased since we put out that raft? So this graph shows loon population growth since 1975. I mentioned earlier that in 1975, there were fewer than 100 loon pairs in the state. Last year, we documented 326 loon pairs in the state. So we've a little more than tripled the population, and we're about halfway to what the expected carrying capacity for loons is in the state of New Hampshire. There's still plenty of lakes that are suitable habitat that could be colonized by loons. Okay, any questions on that before I dive into your loons? I'm sure everyone is most interested in this. So yeah, back in 2019, we got a call from folks on the lake. It may have been someone in here that let us know that a loon was tangled. And so I came down, and folks at the activities center lent us a boat. I had a volunteer with me, and we were able to go out on the lake, catch the loon. The poor thing was so badly tangled that its head was actually sort of being tied down to its back, and so you would think that that would make it easily catchable. It did not. This poor loon, to dive, it had to kind of hop up out of the water and then angle its body downward. And we pursued it for about 2 hours, and we were just about to give up when it finally beached itself at the end of the pond, and we were able to boat up to it and grab it. So this photo on the left is actually after we had cut some of the line, so it doesn't look as bad as it actually was. But if you look at the photo on the right, you can see that that line is all around the loon's tongue. It's really in there, and so we had to really work to very carefully pull that line out. Fortunately, though, we were able to get it all out. There was no other line going down the loon's throat, and so we took a blood sample. I had a lead test machine with me so we could test it, and it was clean. And so we were able to band the loon. We wanted to be able to band it so that we could track it over time and release it back onto the lake that same day, which is always what we want to do if we can. Loons don't do well in captivity. You've probably noticed that you've never seen a loon in a zoo or at an aquarium. That's because they tend to die. They really do not do well in captivity. And so again, we always want to get them back on the lake as soon as we can. And so we abandoned this loon. We hoped that it would return the next year, and he did. So these photos, I guess it's kind of hard to see on the screen, but that left photo, you can see the legs sticking up out of the water, and this loon's bands are visible. On his left leg, he has a green band with a white stripe through it over a white band with a black stripe through it. And so not only did he return in 2020, but he and his mate hatched a chick, which is really exciting. The loon returned again in 2021, so this was the photo that we got in 2021. The loon is bathing in this photo, so most of its body is underwater, but you can see again that leg sticking up with that green stripe band over the white stripe band. Unfortunately, the loons had a really rough year last year. Many of you probably already know. They nested twice. Their first nest attempt failed 22 days in, likely due to predation. That's what our biologists found signs of. You know, the eggs were not whole anymore. It was just a bunch of very small eggshell fragments, and so generally that indicates predation by a mammal. And then they tried again. So they nested a second time. Again, they got to 22, 23 days, very close to the expected hatch date. And unfortunately, the female loon died at that time. And she, we took her for a necropsy, and what we found is that she died from avian malaria. Malaria is an emerging cause of death here in New Hampshire. The first documented case was in 2015. It was a loon from Lake Abagog. And since then, we have documented a handful of other cases, including your loon, also including a female loon from Hughes Lake in Sutton. And so, they were 22 days in. They were so close to the hatch, but one loon just can't do it on its own, and so that nest attempt sadly failed as well. I have heard reports from some people here tonight that 2 loons are back on the lake now and seem to be acting as a pair, so I'm really glad to hear that, and to hear that that vacancy has been filled. Sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes it takes a couple of years for it to fill in. So hopefully they will use, they'll nest again. Typically, the male loon has a little bit more say than the female does where the nest goes, and so when you lose your male loon, they might, pick a new site that's not as successful. Since you still have your experienced male, or you should, hopefully, I haven't gotten any pictures of him yet so far this year, but if anyone sees him or sees bands or gets pictures of bands, please do send them to us. But since he should still be here, hopefully they'll, nest in their same spot that they've had success in, and get us some chicks this year. So that's what I've got for you guys, and I'm glad to answer any questions. And maybe for this part we could turn the lights on just so I can see everyone a little better. Thank you. I hope my voice was loud enough for everyone to hear throughout. Yes?
It amazes me that you could get the fishing line out of the mouth of that loon, and I wondered, is it just the way you held it that you could quiet it down, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so fortunately I had a lot of help. A lot of the folks from I don't know what the official name of it is, but like the activity center, the place that lends the boat. 3 of their staff members came out. I should have put pictures of it here, but we had one of them holding the loon's body, one of them holding the head steady for me, and then I was able to open the mouth and just very carefully, very slowly pull all of that line out. So it took quite a while to make sure, and another thing that we need to be really careful about when we're doing that is that if there's tackle going down the throat, or if there's line going down the throat, that line could have a hook on it. And so we don't want to just be yanking on that, right? Because it could be embedded in something and cause a problem. So we have to be really careful, make sure that the line that we're moving is not going down the throat. So it takes some time. Yeah, but I know when I first saw this, I thought, how am I going to do that? But it really worked out, and it had a lot to do with just the number of people who were willing to help. Yes?
Do the loons struggle while you're working on them, or do they seem to settle in and realize?
They tend to struggle at first, and there are some that continue to do that throughout. And it makes sense, right? They don't know that we're trying to help, and they think they're being attacked. A lot of the time, we're able to put a towel over the loon's eyes, and that does help to calm them down. So you can see in this photo on the left, We do have a towel there, and we had moved it so I could get the picture, but then, we resumed putting it over the loon's eyes to try to keep it calm. Yes?
Where would the loon pick up avian malaria?
It's a good question, and it's something that's actively being investigated. What we know so far is that the majority of loons that have died from there are a couple things we know. The first is that 10 different strains of malaria have been found in loons, and only one of them seems to be the one that is causing mortality. The others, we've detected in blood samples from healthy loons. So there's this one strain, and I think the name that the scientists working on it is using is Catust 05. That's the deadly strain. What we've also found is that the majority of loons that have died from avian malaria are females that were nesting. And so it could be that as they're nesting, these mosquitoes they're getting them, and for whatever reason, it could be due to the timing that the male versus female is on the nest. It could be due to something else. We're not totally sure yet. But those nesting females are the ones that are more often getting bit by the mosquito species containing, that are infected with that parasite. Yes?
Can you talk about for a moment about the loon call, which is very distinctive, and we probably all heard it. Is there something physiological about that allows them to do that? Is there an evolutionary purpose to it?
It's a good question. And so, are you talking about one specific call, or sort of just all of the different calls that they make?
All of the different calls, because they're so loud and so distinctive.
Yeah, and all of those calls have different purposes. I wonder, is there Wi-Fi in here? Does anyone know? There is. Okay, because if I can connect, then I can play you some calls. Does anyone know which one I should be trying to use? Is it Draper?
Yes.
Okay. And this works because then I can play you the Yodel, which is, we talked earlier about how that's the one that you can use to determine the male versus female. This is our website, by the way, so we've got a lot of some information on here if you wanted to learn more. So here's the whale I'll play first. Hopefully it'll play loudly enough. So that one is used for long distance communication between mated pairs of loons. As you all know, the loons don't necessarily stay together every second of every day, and so if they become separated, they need to be able to get back together. So the whale is used for that. There's also the hoot. Sounds like its name, and it's a short distance communication that the members of the pair will use, and they'll also hoot to their chicks as well. They give different versions of this, so a higher pitched, more frantic sounding hoot is usually given as loons start to engage with an intruder loon. They sort of alert each other to the presence of that loon. This is the Yodel. This is a really cool one, not only because only males make it, but also because each male loon's Yodel is distinct, and so they're able to tell each other apart, which is really beneficial in a species that fights sometimes to the death, right? If you can recognize someone that you fought before and lost to, probably you're not going to challenge that one again. Whereas if you won, you might be more willing to take that one on. It also helps, loons coming back to recognize their parents and maybe not try to take over that particular territory. And then there's the tremolo. So that is a call that's used when loons are feeling stressed or threatened by something. So you'll often hear tremolos when an intruder is coming in, when they hear or when they see an eagle going overhead. If someone, a boat or a swimmer or whatever gets too close to them or their nest or their chicks, those are all instances where you might hear that call. And I didn't talk about it when we played the Yodel, but it's sort of used for the same purposes. It's a very aggressive call that male loons make to show, whatever threat that they're perceiving, that they're the territory holder and they're willing to really fight to defend themselves, their chick, their territory from whatever threat they're perceiving. Physiologically, no one really knows how they're doing this. It's actually being studied now. There's a team at, I don't remember which university, but they're trying to make models of the syrinx and figure out exactly how they're doing this, because we don't totally know yet. Yes?
Two questions. One is, I noticed the chick has like a brown eye. When does it go red?
Yeah, so sometime over that period when they're on the ocean, it seems, because even when they're on the lakes in the fall, it's still more of a brown. And the adult loons too, when they're in their winter plumage, their eye, it stays red, but it dulls down to much more of a brownish red. But yeah, at some point between the time that they get to the ocean at 3-4 months old and when they return at 3 years old is when they get that red eye.
And my second question was, when you were talking about the line being wrapped around and possibly going down the throat, would it be possible just to cut that line and let the hook pocket, there's a hook, to let it just drop?
Yeah, so we will often do that if we don't feel like we can safely pull on that line. We typically are taking loons to the vet as well, so we didn't for this case because it was clear that the line was primarily external. But if there's line going down the throat, we will absolutely take it to the vet for a radiograph so that we can see where the metal is and we can determine if it's stuck in an area where it's going to be a problem, or if it's in an area where it should move through the digestive system just fine. Yes.
An observation and a question.
Sure.
The observation, I've been here for 38 years.
Uh-huh.
And about 6 or 7 years ago, we had a nesting pair here. And we also had a non-breeding juvenile that came inland for the season and was here for the whole summer.
Yeah.
In addition, the nesting pair that we had 2 successful chicks. And then on one day, we had another pair visit us for the day from somewhere else in the area. So on that day, we had 7 loons on this lake all on the same day.
Yeah. Yeah, it can get pretty busy, especially on lakes where there are chicks. And especially later in the season, those other loons that either have not been successful in that year or don't have a territory of their own, they do tend to come and visit, and particularly visit lakes that have chicks.
And then my question is this avian influenza that's attacking our water birds and some of our chickens, are the loons susceptible to the infection with that agent as well?
It's a really, really good question. It's something that we've been consulting with state agencies, veterinarians, rehabbers on a national and even international scale to try to figure it out. No one totally knows yet exactly how loons are going to be affected. Primarily what people are talking about right now is how to keep ourselves safe as we're going out to, handle a loon or, rescue a loon, ban loons, collect a dead loon. So primarily so far the discussions have been around what PPE to wear. And so far I don't believe any loons have been documented to have it, but they're just getting back to our lakes, right? And so mortalities on the ocean are pretty easy to overlook, because there aren't people keeping an eye on the loons and routinely monitoring for them and around the shoreline, and because it's easy for them to just get washed out somewhere where they're not going to feed out. So probably we'll learn a lot more about how susceptible they are to it in the coming weeks and months. No one has any idea right now, but we're all concerned, and any loon that we rescue this year is going to be screened for it, and we'll just learn as we go. Yes?
Just getting back to that lead, are there any effort to coordinate with some of our neighboring states, especially from the south, that come up here on vacation, they don't know about it?
So there is the Fish Lead Free Initiative, which is between New Hampshire, Maine, Vermont, Massachusetts, and New York. It's a regional initiative to try to get lead out of people's tackle boxes, to inform people about the problem. So there is some work being done there. there's always probably room for more work to be done, but we're all really working on trying to get the word out and reach folks who might be coming here. Yes?
Is that something that a lake host would do when fishermen are coming onto a lake? Would they inform them that it's illegal to have lead tackle here?
So we have worked with New Hampshire lakes on that in the past. I don't think it's something that they've been able to implement on every single lake because different lakes have different priorities and want to make sure that they're, hitting those priorities before trying to take on anything else. So on certain lakes, that has been, successful in something that they're doing, but not on all lakes that have lake hosts.
Oh, has anyone thought of putting up just a sign where the lake host is saying no lead?
Yeah, so we do. We do have signs out now that we're actually going to be replacing at all the boat launches throughout the state with an updated version, hopefully this summer. Yeah, the old version of the sign that we had was so word heavy, like several paragraphs, that probably no one was reading it. The new one that we're hoping to put out this year is more, image based and has a little bit less text. So we're hoping that people will actually look at it and, read it and take that information in. Yes?
My understanding was lead was like banned a long time ago, maybe different states. Also, I'd like to address like PCBs and other contaminants like, washing fireproof kids' clothing through septics that go into lakes. What's affecting these birds? And again, when was lead banned?
Yeah, so there's been lead legislation since the late 90s, and it's kind of been added to over time until we got to the point we're at now, where all lead sinkers and lead-headed jigs under 1 ounce are banned. Prior to that, it started out with, I think, just sinkers, and then jigs were added, but it was jigs that measured 1 inch or less, which was not very protective for loons because they were ingesting, or 1 inch or more, 1 inch or less. They were still ingesting and dying from jigs that were still legal under that law. And so the law has really been iterative over time for about, 20, 25 years. Yeah, and so, lead that was still legal as of 2013 when the current law was passed could still be could have, and was still killing loons up to that point.
And the second question was, PCBs and, fireproof pajamas going through septic into lakes and so on.
Yeah, so
that's affecting loons.
That's a big part of our research now, and it's something that one of our biologists is working on, hoping to publish a paper on. We've recently released our egg report, so if you go to loon.org/egg report, you'll get to this page and you can pull up our contaminant report, which has a lot of information on all of this, and it also lists at the very end every egg that we've tested, and the levels of different contaminants, PFAS, BDEs, PCBs, DDE, chloridane. So you can find a lot of information in this egg report. So far we haven't been able to, or it's just relatively new research for us, so we have not yet quantified exactly how it's affecting loon reproductive success, but that's a research project that is being it's underway now. Yes?
Can I suggest to you that you might suggest to some of the people in the audience that you guys put out this wonderful magazine if they join the conservation group, and you get all sorts of information, of those you can't see it. I think it's quarterly, I'm not sure how often.
Twice per year, we do a summer edition and a fall edition.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's our newsletter. It goes out to all of our members twice per year, and it's got lots of articles on the work we've been doing, research updates, and things of that nature. Thank you. And I guess I should mention that May is our membership drive, member day May. So if you become a member, in addition to receiving that newsletter, you also are entered to win a raffle prize. We have 4 prizes, all are loon themed. So please do consider becoming an LPC member.
You might also suggest that wonderful location that you guys have if they go there and see all the stuff.
Thank you. Yes, so we have the Loon Center in Moulton Borough. It's on Lees Mill Road. It's on Lakewood and Pisaki. We have a center with lots of exhibits. We actually just recently redid the exhibits, although now we're in line for a general contractor to come install them. So my suggestion would be come in June if you want to see the new updated exhibits. And yeah, we've got the center, we've got good documentary that we play for folks, and we've got some walking trails out to the lake out back as well. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on any impact on loons related to changes in the polar magnetic field?
Oh, that is a really good question.
It affects some birds.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, not one that I've been asked before, not one that to my knowledge has been studied in loons, so I'm not totally sure, but that's a really good question.
Well, they think the fly somewhere and they have to know where to go.
Yeah, and a lot of animals do use that, the poles to figure out where to go, so, yeah, good research
I
project.
heard that it was affecting monarch butterflies, but everybody is crazy about monarchs now.
Right. Yes?
Mercury, as far as you ever mentioned.
So mercury is something that was really studied in the 90s and through the 2000s. It's something that has been documented at high levels in loon eggs on certain lakes in New Hampshire. The data from that, from the loon eggs and loon blood samples actually was used in a study that, made recommendations for, to equip certain power plants with scrubbers and things to try to get that out. We are now seeing a slight downward trend in mercury levels, so we're hoping that that continues. It is something that we're testing the eggs for in addition to all of the other contaminants. Oh, okay. If anyone has any other questions, you can meet me in the parking lot.